And the first of our speakers will be our guest presenter, Archdeacon Alan Perry, General Secretary for the Anglican Church of Canada, who has looked deeply into the basic income debate and has consented to illuminate it for us and respond to our questions and comments. Please welcome Archdeacon Perry.
Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Pastor James and Pastor Anna, and everyone who's come. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got a little bit of a presentation, and so hopefully this will work. There we go. So you've heard the word basic income, and it means a number of things to a number of people, but let's start with just a very light touch on sort of theologically why we would be interested in this conversation. I will not give an exhaustive theology of poverty or anything like that, but just touch lightly on concepts that you're already very familiar with. Well, first of all, to say that inequality is a problem in Canada, it's growing in Canada and elsewhere. The phrase, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, is actually quite true in Western societies. And so poverty is a concern for all of us, I would suggest. God calls his attention repeatedly in the Bible to his care for the widow, the orphan, and the poor. And I took a quick glance and found over 200 references to the poor in the Bible. So it's a theme that comes up again and again and again. I would suggest that theologically, poverty is a violation of human dignity. It's a violation of the divine image in each human being. God did not create us to be poor. He created us to thrive and to flourish. And the gospel, as you know, is in part good news for the poor. Matthew 11:5 says the poor have good news brought to them. So my question would be, what does that good news look like? What could it look like? If the gospel is about good news for the poor, how do we make that good news come about? So one option would be universal basic income. You've heard Pastor James use that phrase in the homily this morning. It's pretty simple. Everyone in a society gets an unconditional cash payment. Say, for example, $1,000 a month. Everybody, just because you live here, gets $1,000 a month, every month without fail from the government. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But there are other forms of basic income. There's what's called a targeted basic income. So in this case, everyone in a specific demographic receives an unconditional cash payment. So you might say, you know, everybody within a certain age range, or all single parents, or, you know, some other targeted demographic gets an unconditional cash payment. And the third concept is the guaranteed income. And in this, everyone whose income is under a certain threshold receives enough to bring them up to that threshold. So if the threshold is $1,000 a month and you earn $500 a month, you get $500. If you earn $750, you get $250. So everybody is sort of brought up to that minimum level of a certain standard. So why would this be a good thing? Well, these are all ways of addressing poverty. Poverty, it's been pointed out, is not because of a lack of industry or a lack of effort. Poverty is fundamentally a lack of money. Everybody needs money to survive. You know that in your own life. And so this is just a way of getting money into people's pockets so that they can spend it on the essentials of life. Another good thing about it is that people who have low income, who receive more income, tend to spend it. You know, it doesn't just sit around in their pockets for very long. They put it to use to pay the rent, pay the groceries, etc. And that actually turns out to be good for the economy. Our economy is based on people spending money. So if people have more money and spend more money, that actually works out to be good for them and good for the economy. If the income is unconditional, there's no stigma associated with it. You know, there's often a stigma of receiving social assistance. People are looked down upon because they're somehow, you know, living off the generosity of the government. And so an unconditional payment removes the stigma associated with poverty. It promotes human dignity, which is, I suggest, a good thing as well. And the other reason why it's considered a good thing is it's simple and it's easy to administer. There's not much bureaucracy. If you're just cutting a check for $1,000 a month to everybody, that's pretty straightforward. And so it's pretty simple to administer. Of course, if you move from a universal to a targeted to a guaranteed income, you have to start applying criteria. And the more criteria that are applied, the more bureaucracy required to administer it. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, given our various options. I'll point out that Canada already has a form of basic income. We call it old age security. There I see from one or two faces on the screen that a couple of you might be familiar with this regular payment. Originally, it was just universal. Everybody over 65 got this payment. It was a targeted basic income for the demographic of people over 65. These days, it's means tested. That started in the 1980s. So there's a clawback. If you earn over a certain amount of money, you start to lose some of your old age security. And if you reach a certain level of income, you lose it entirely. On top of the old age security, there's also the guaranteed income supplement, which is a kind of guaranteed minimum. So it's an extra payment for those who have little other income. Basically, if all you've got coming in is old age security and Canada Pension Plan, you pretty much qualify for the guaranteed income supplement. So just a bit of extra money in the pocket. This program has done absolute wonders for poverty among seniors. Because of it, seniors are the demographic in Canada least likely to experience poverty. That's extraordinary. It's been a game changer since it was introduced. So basic incomes do work. There's some other examples of basic income that exist today in our structure. You've got the Canada Child Benefit, which is a form of targeted basic income. If you've got a child and then you get a certain amount of money. That's pretty straightforward. And it's had a tremendous effect on reducing child poverty. Over 300,000 children lifted out of poverty as a result of the introduction of the Canada Child Benefit. Another is the GST or HST credit, which is just paid out to people who have under a certain level of income as a way of sort of getting the GST back into their pockets. These programs and related programs have had a tremendous impact on reducing poverty rates for the targeted recipients. HST is harmonized sales tax, which exists in places other than Alberta, where they blend the provincial sales tax and the goods and services tax at the federal level. So for example, in Ontario, there's a blended tax of 13% called HST. There's a problem though with these kinds of programs. One of them is that you need to file your taxes in order to get the benefits. And there's a lot of people who, for a variety of reasons, don't actually file taxes. And so they miss out. In fact, I was familiar with a couple who volunteered for many, many years at the cathedral in downtown Edmonton, just to help people file their taxes so that they would get these benefits. Tremendous effort, but you know, it's that kind of bureaucracy. So why would a guaranteed basic income or a universal basic income be popular? Well, it's pretty simple. Everyone can imagine having more money in their pocket. It's very straightforward. There's nobody here who can't imagine that possibility. So what would you do with $1,000 a month extra, for example? Well, my suggestion is that it depends on your circumstances. If you're earning sort of more than $250,000 a year, you might not notice that extra $1,000 a month very much. And it would become less and less noticeable as your income level goes up. If you're earning, you know, a very comfortable, thank you very much, middle class wage of 100,000 to 250, you might, you know, pay down the mortgage if you still have one. You might pay down other debt if you've got it. You might invest the money. You might go on a cruise. Maybe you'll just donate it to the church. Lots of things you could do with $1,000 a month if you have that kind of income. If you're sort of, you know, a little closer to average, earning between 60 and 100,000 a year, you might say replace that 10-year-old car that you've got. You might do those postponed renovations on your house that you've been sort of hoping to get around to. You might help the kids or the grandkids with their tuition. You would probably use that money creatively and helpfully. If you're somewhere between the poverty line and $60,000, well, you might create a bit of a cushion for retirement or for a rainy day, or do other things to improve your life. If you're living under the poverty line, you probably would spend that money buying groceries or buying new clothing for the children. Maybe you'd buy a transit pass. Maybe you'd go to the movies once in a while, pay the rent. So really, a truly universal basic income would make a different impact on different people based on their current circumstances, from a very substantial improvement in terms of just being able to buy groceries to, you know, maybe just having a little bit of extra fun money. So why not just do it? Why not just implement it? Well, one is a cost. The truly universal basic income would cost a tremendous amount. Fast math, 30 million adults receiving $1,000 per month would cost $360 billion per year. That's a very substantial amount of money. That's almost twice the current federal budget. So criteria then, you're not going to have a universal basic income, maybe targeted or a basic minimum income. So it would be less costly, but it requires very careful design to ensure that it reaches the people it needs to. When you look at criteria, you've got to ask questions like, who's included? What are the criteria precisely for inclusion? And who's left out? Because there will always be people left out. You know, there are people who don't get the old age security because they simply don't apply for it. Well, that's an interesting problem, isn't it? Especially if you really need that money. The other issue, though, is it doesn't address the problem of the commodification of the basics. Housing, for example, pharmaceuticals, for example, these are treated as commodities. Why is it that pharmaceutical companies are on track to make billions and billions and billions of dollars with COVID vaccines? Why should these things not be available to us and to everybody around the world at no cost? Why are these companies going to make such a profit? Why do homes cost as much as they do? Why does a house in Toronto cost 2 or 3 times what it costs in Edmonton? No idea. It's because these are being treated as commodities. And so that's a problem in our society, which creates affordability problems that are not necessarily solved by a universal basic income. The other issue to be aware of is the law of unintended consequences. We've got campaigns across the country for a living wage. Last time I looked, it was something close to $17 an hour in Edmonton. So if people suddenly got $1,000 a month, would that take some pressure off those campaigns? Would companies start to say, well, we don't need to pay people a living wage or a decent minimum wage because after all, they've got all this money coming from the government? That would be an interesting problem as well. Would a universal basic income, thinking about the commodification of housing, would it just become a transfer to landlords? You know, would landlords jack up the rent knowing that their tenants have more money? And then, you know, they wind up getting the benefit rather than the tenants. So universal basic income is a bit of a two-edged sword, would be my suggestion. Universal basic income is the answer to a fundamental question. What if everyone had more money? And that, as I've suggested, is a very straightforward question to answer. You know, what would that look like? Well, people could do all sorts of good things like pay the rent, buy groceries, etc. But there's another question we could ask. What if everyone needed less money? And the answer to that question is universal basic services. We could have, instead of cash transfers, we could have transfers in kind coming to everyone. So for example, Medicare, we're very familiar with that. Massive game changer when it was introduced. We hear constantly the horror stories of what goes on in people's lives in the US when they go bankrupt because they get sick or injured. Medicare changed that for us in Canada, and there are some pretty strong campaigns for it in the US as well. Well, what if we extended Medicare to include dental care? I've read some surveys that suggest that your teeth are part of your body, unless you've got dentures. So, so in fact, you know, why not include dental care in Medicare? Why do we pay for dental care in Canada? What about pharmacare? Why do we pay for drugs? Imagine if you could just walk into the pharmacy and get the drugs that are prescribed for you and not have to pay. That would be a huge game changer for a lot of people. And there are other kinds of services that could be available to us, you know, for little or no money, ideally free. What about free tuition? There are a number of countries around the world that offer free tuition to anybody who's qualified to and interested in going to university. What a massive game changer. It would just reduce or eliminate student debt, which would be huge. You know, student debt in the US is making a material impact on the housing market because people graduate with so much debt they can't afford to buy a house. Imagine that. What would free tuition do? How about free childcare or very cheap childcare? There was the $25 a day target project or pilot project in Alberta a couple of years ago that changed all sorts of people's equations in terms of being able to, you know, go out and work and make sure that their children were cared for during that time. In Quebec, it was introduced at $5 a day. I think it's about 8 something now per day. Massive change in participation rate of women in the labor force and a huge improvement in people's ability to earn an income and live more decently. Of course, it's not just about warehousing children, it's about early childhood education. Preparing children for school and improving their later lives and outcome. What about subsidized housing? Affordable housing for people who can't afford housing. How about free transit? Wow, imagine you just got on the bus or the LRT and didn't have to pay money for it. Wouldn't that be great? That's been done in a number of places. Dunkirk, for example, in France, offers free transit now. The entire nation of Luxembourg offers free transit to everybody, and other places. Downtown Edmonton, it seems to me, once upon a time offered free LRT, and currently, last I looked, downtown Salt Lake City offers free transit as well. How about broadband? You know, there's what we call the digital divide in Canada, where in some parts of our country, people don't have adequate bandwidth to be able to do things like join Zoom conversations and so on. Well, what if we just made broadband available for free? There are some people suggesting that. What other kind of basic services should be available universally? You know, there's no reason why the basic essentials of life couldn't be provided for out of our tax money. We do it already with all sorts of things like roads, for example. If you drove to church today, or if you're, you know, you drive out to get your groceries or whatever, you don't pay for the roads directly. You pay indirectly through your taxes. So why not extend that concept to other universal basic services? The issue then would be we don't need to have as much money in our pockets because we get the things that we need automatically for free. So the bottom line, Poverty fundamentally is policy choice. We choose policies that create the haves and the have-nots. We choose policies that create poverty. Inequality in our society is growing and is out of control. The average CEO in Canada earns 202 times as much as the average worker. In the US, it's over 300 times. That's ridiculous. Who's worth 202 times as much as the average worker? And the ratio is growing. But we can choose different policies that eliminate poverty. It's been pointed out recently that Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, could give $105,000 to every single one of his employees worldwide and still have as much money as he had a year ago at the beginning of the pandemic. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. And the reason he has amassed that much money is because of the policies that allow him to do so. But we can choose different policies. Exactly which policies we choose is a matter of debate. Whether some kind of minimum or targeted or universal income, whether some kind of expanded universal services, these are policies that I think all could go in the mix. And I want to suggest that it's not either or, it can be both and. Universal income or targeted income or guaranteed minimum income would help different groups of people. Universal services would pretty much help everybody. And so there is a both and possibility here. So there's some debate about which policies we choose, but some kind of universal transfer, whether cash or services, would definitely make a huge difference in moving us toward the goal of eliminating poverty. The one thing I can say with certainty is cutting taxes doesn't cut it. That doesn't solve the problem, just helps the rich. I'm going to leave you with a few resources, and I hope somebody's recording these. So there's a really helpful book by Lars Osberg, who is an economist at Dalhousie University in Halifax, called The Age of Increasing Inequality. Very useful book to read. Helpful documentary by Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, called Inequality for All. You can find that on Netflix, and occasionally you can find it for free on YouTube as well. So definitely worth watching that. Joseph Stiglitz, who is a US economist, a Nobel Prize winning economist, wrote a really helpful book called The Price of Inequality. He talks about not just the economic cost of inequality, but also the political and social cost of inequality. Very helpful book. And Rutger Bregman, a young historian and journalist in the Netherlands, wrote a tremendous book called Utopia for Realists, which sets out the possibility of both a universal basic income and, for those of us still working, a 15-hour work week. Imagine that. So a really helpful book as well. So there's a couple of resources that you could read at your leisure to stimulate some of your thinking. That's what I've got to share. I think it'll be much more interesting if we have a few conversations at this stage of the game. So I'm going to turn off my sharing. Thank you. Probably have some questions or comments or some angry rebuttals. Don and Trudy Schoberg, am I pronouncing your name halfway decently?
Yes, yes. Well, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Initially, I thought it was only going to be a presentation of, the guaranteed kind of income. It's what really opened my eyes to the different possibilities and how complicated that gets also. My question is, where do you know of places in the world where versions of the support has been introduced and is successful? That would be my one question.
Sure. Well, the universal basic income is actually an idea that's been kicking around for a couple of 100 years. And it has been implemented in pilot projects in a number of places. In Canada, back in the 1970s, it was done in Dauphin, Manitoba. And the initial results were quite staggering. They saw not only a general economic improvement for people under the poverty line, but they had some unintended benefits as well, or unanticipated. Reductions in domestic violence, for example, reductions in people visiting the emergency room at the hospital, women who were out working in low-paid jobs suddenly had enough that they could live decently while going to school and improve their circumstances. One young woman went back to school and became the town librarian, for example, and got a better job, better paying job than she had been able to manage before. Young men who would have dropped out of high school in order to make money to help their families survive were able to complete high school and even go into higher education because of the universal basic income or guaranteed minimum income, which was applied. This was a pilot project that was ultimately cut off with a change in government. Now there's a scholar in Manitoba named Evelyn Forget who has written extensively over the last couple of decades about basic minimum income, and she's a very strong advocate. There have been pilot projects in California. There have been pilot projects in Finland. Ontario started one briefly, and then that was killed off with a change of government. So it's certainly been tried, and the benefits have been clear, and there don't seem to be too many downsides. So there's a couple of examples of places where it's been tried. Now, mind you, there was just a huge study done in British Columbia, about a 500-page report, which you can find as well, BC minimum income, which came to the conclusion that, in fact, there might be some other ways of addressing poverty. And fair enough. Evelyn Forget has written a very helpful article suggesting that, well, she disagrees with their conclusions, but it's out there anyway. So yes, it's been tried, and it's been pretty successful where it's been tried. Other questions? I don't think you're Lois, but Lois Flagstad.
Yeah, I'm Nordal Flagstad. I really appreciate on your presentation. It's an area that I've been interested in for quite a while. But I think one of the issues that, and incidentally, the BC report, which I've only read the summary of, is really, really useful. It's been come across as being negative to it, but there's a lot of good ideas in there. Mm-hmm. I have a bit of a background in economics, and it's not full of chart busting, as they sometimes say. There's some very good notions there of I don't know, Christian intervention in a way, not specifically stated in those terms, but it's really worth reading even the summary. My question in part is the route to doing some of this kind of stuff. I know there are some groups working through political parties. I don't know. I know, like, for instance, there are other things that have come along, like the peace movement or whatever, that have sort of gathered people. I think one of the challenges is that with all the different areas that you can work in, whether it's, the ones that you mentioned, what routes can people go? And maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I think churches can speak with a very significant voice to start with. I know several Anglican bishops have written to the government pressing for universal basic income, and there's no reason why we can't raise our voice collectively and ecumenically as churches. There are other organizations in civil society that are pressing for the end of poverty. One of the better better known national ones is a group called Canada Without Poverty. And they're working very hard at addressing poverty. I understand there's I think it's a private members bill coming to the federal parliament as well to implement a universal basic income. So it's an idea that has a lot of traction right now. And I think, write to your MP, write to your MLA, that's really important. Talk it up during election time, lots of ways of getting involved. So there are definitely organizations in civil society, as I say, who would gladly partner with us as Christians to work for the end of poverty. The key fundamental problem is the existence of poverty, and how we get to the end of it may be a matter of some debate, but I don't think there are too many people who see poverty as a good thing. We've got to get rid of it. But there's a couple of ideas anyway. Kirsten.
I want to thank you for mentioning the universal services. Because I've heard some of the dialogue around the universal basic income, that's kind of where my focus has been, but reminding us of that idea of basic services is like, oh yeah, that makes so much more sense, because I hadn't thought, especially when you mentioned about the commodities. I thought, just the idea of housing, that there's so much invested in that, and what could be the unintended consequences of that. That was very, very valuable. But I mean, and as much as I hadn't thought so much about the basic services, the accessibility, the universal accessibility of that spoke very, very strongly to so many things, housing, food. I would love to see a little bit more better accessibility to healthcare. While we do have Medicare in Canada, I'm a patient navigator, and so I deal with this on a regular basis, the ability of people, or the inability of people, to access timely care, and the fact that they don't necessarily, they can't, when they have less income, when they live below the poverty line, it does impact them, but also the reverse is also true. The more illness they have, the more it impacts their income, and then they tend to end up in poverty. So these are very important issues to me. And so a couple of years ago, when I started my practice as a patient navigator, I started as a private practice, but I've definitely been feeling called to bring it as a not-for-profit organization that becomes universally accessible. I still need to figure out how that will come about. To Nordal's point, I've been exploring social enterprise, which also is not a perfect model, but trying to figure out where can the funds come from in order to make sure I can live sustainably while also helping others. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. A helpful resource on the question of universal basic services is the economist Armin Yalnizyan, who is an Atkinson Fellow right now. She worked for a number of years for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And there's a really helpful article on the policyalternatives.ca website. If you Google Armin Yalnizyan, spelled just like it sounds, she's a very helpful advocate for universal basic services.
Sorry, that was alternative what? Alternative?
The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so their website is policyalternatives.ca. I see a blue hand from Colleen Vogel.
Hi, Mark Sandy. One of your slides showing positive concepts said more money for everyone. Is it fair to say that's just a redistribution through taxation?
The money would have to come from somewhere, and yes, probably we'd have to start taxing billionaires a bit more effectively than we do now, and maybe millionaires too. So, and many of us, I think, would pay higher taxes. I mean, if you got free tuition, you might find that your taxes go up a little bit, but you would the trade-off would be that you'd be getting more than that back. Most of us would anyway, in say tuition or childcare or what have you. Eugene Ulmer.
I'm wondering what government's stand would be on this. I'm sure their argument would be, where do we get this extra money to do this? Is there political will to do this? What's the stand on government so far?
Well, Armenia Nizian raises the issue of political will in her work, and she suggests that universal basic services is probably politically more palatable because everybody benefits. You know, you get your tuition for free, you get your drugs for free, regardless of who you are, whether you're rich or poor. And so there might be some better buy-in politically with that kind of approach, she suggests. That said, as I said before, I don't think it's either or. I think it can be both and. So some kind of improvement in the services that we have available, plus some kind of guaranteed minimum income, might still be the way to go forward. But I suspect, and Evelyn Forget has said, you know, really nobody's talking about, say, spending $360 billion a year just to cut a check for everybody. That probably is a non-starter. But yeah, I mean, the money to do this would have to come from somewhere, and the somewhere would be taxes. Back to Lois Flaxted, yes. Sorry, I'm using the name on the screen.
Yeah, no, I know. I do the speaking for this so that you realize, and I like the list of resources, and I hope that it's available. But I bought the Evelyn Forget's books quite some time ago, which it actually covers a lot of good stuff, and it's not a very long read, but it's a very profound read. So if you want to get basic income for Canadians, and it's a good starter at least.
Thank you. Yes, there are tons of resources out there, so I've just chosen a few that I've come across. But yes, she's a very fine advocate for basic income. I don't see everybody on my screen, so I don't know if you're. Oh, Carl, you're raising a blue hand. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? I can't see myself. I don't intend to be invisible, but somehow I have become invisible. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Carl.
Okay, thank you. The business of political will strikes me as hugely important. So one of the things that the BC study does is it's got 65 recommendations in it. But the advantage I could see for the BC government is it doesn't have to put one huge thing in place. What it can do is pick and choose a few of these little things as it perceives to be most useful or popular, and can start to work on those things one by one, and maybe incrementally, which I think the study suggests, gradually build up the support services that are available and make them better and work better than they do at the moment. Whereas your basic income, there are some people who have suggested at the far end of the spectrum, yes, let's do maybe not universal, but a basic income, and get rid of all of the services. Don't have any services at all, so that people can pick and choose what they want to do, you know, and exercise their own free will to do it. But for me, if you're going to put things in place that are tax supported, it does seem that what they've given the BC government is something that they might find doable. So I do have a question. The question is, as we work on what you would call universal basic services, do you see that there is a particular role for the basic income along with it, or are we trying to get rid of the basic income by putting in place all of the services?
Well, so my suggestion would be that it's not either or. I think there's room for both approaches. The criticism of the BC report from Evelyn Forget is that she said that there are something like 107 different programs for addressing poverty. Well, that's just nuts. And so if you're going to start picking and choosing among 65 different approaches, that means nudging a little bit at the problem here and there in a sort of a piecemeal manner, which is going to take some time to implement. I mean, even if they got to all 65 over the next, I don't know, 20 years or something, real people are suffering from poverty now. And so how do we change the game for people right now? How long should people have to wait for improvements in their lives? That's a huge question. So, and just on the question of services versus basic income, yeah, the right really loves basic income because they see it as a way of getting rid of all the government services, small government, and where would that end? Would you have to pay a toll when you get off your driveway onto the public street? Probably not, but we'd start paying a lot more for a lot of things that we take for granted now within Canadian society fairly quickly, I suspect. So it's not a panacea. I suspect personally that it's a question of both and how do we design a relatively straightforward basic minimum income so people have the money they need to be able to live decently while providing adequate services that people don't go bankrupt getting things like education or healthcare or childcare or what have you. So I think it's both and. Hi, you're not Douglas, but Douglas Johns.
Okay.
One of the criticisms I've heard about having a basic income is that it reduces the incentive for people to work. Is there research about that shows whether or not that's true?
There's very specific research about that. In fact, the pilot project that's going on in California right now is showing quite the opposite, that people are actually looking for better jobs rather than not working. I think in California they're getting $500 a month, and similarly the project in Dauphin, Manitoba showed that people may drop out of the workforce temporarily in order to improve their skills. It's not a question of sort of sitting back and living off the fat of the land. It's a question of maybe investing some time and having the ability to do that, to be able to improve skills and get a better job. So there doesn't seem to be any correlation between people getting a basic income and just kind of lazing about. Most people want to work, they want to be productive, they want to do something creative and helpful. And so that's, you probably find a few, but not many.
Great, thank you.
Cindy Schreiner.
Hi. I work in the financial services industry in downtown Edmonton. So I see an awful lot of the homeless people, people unable to hold jobs for various reasons. And they are, many of them are on AISH. And how do you see this integrating with programs like that? What it would be the delivery to ensure that people, like some of them are just underemployed and cannot afford, they have to work at very low paying jobs or casual jobs, and they just don't have enough to support themselves. So they are on these social service programs. How do you see something like this integrating with other programs so that they're deliverable to people maybe with no fixed address or the inability to get a bank account or things like that?
Well, there are a lot of complexities there, of course. So just on the question of not getting a bank account because you have no fixed address, there is actually a bank downtown called the Four Directions Bank, which was set up by ATB specifically for that issue. But AISH and income support, they're just inadequate amounts of money, frankly. I mean, I don't know how people survive on them. So that's one of the issues. You know, a basic minimum income would improve people's lives who are living on AISH and income support, because surely there have to be higher levels of income to start with. Secondly, there are some wraparound services that are provided for people on AISH and with on income support, services in terms of you know, access to social work and various kinds of therapy and assistance in living and so on, that would have to be continued, I think. People are not on AISH because they want to be on AISH. People are on AISH because they have absolutely no other choice in life. And we need to do a better job of treating people with dignity. And there's the issue too of stigma. You know, that a universal income, a truly universal income would just eliminate stigma. Again, people on income support or AISH need to be recognized first and foremost as human beings and children of God. And the level of stigma that's associated with, you know, being on these programs is just unacceptable. So it's a complex problem, but you know, people have, let's say, people don't want to be on income support or AISH. They're on those programs because they have no other choices, and we need to find better ways of addressing their poverty. You know, for people who are homeless, who are experiencing homelessness, there are some very fine advocates, including the Canadian Association for Ending Homelessness, and of course the City of Edmonton's campaign to end homelessness. Very, very important campaigns. And the most promising approach seems to be, you know, just giving people a home. You know, give them a home, give them the wraparound services they need to be able to live successfully in a home. You know, housing first, rather than making them jump through various hoops and achieve certain goals before they get to have a home. And in fact, you know, homelessness and poverty are costing us people's lives, first and foremost, but also costing billions and billions and billions of dollars in terms of just managing those conditions. Well, you know, that money could be better spent just giving people the ability to live decently and with dignity. Other questions? Is there somebody in the social room? I'm seeing movement there. Eugene Ulmer.
So are you aware of, I'm wondering if this is primarily a federal matter or a provincial matter? Is it a combination of both? Are federal parties addressing this at all? I sort of expect the NDP would be stronger in addressing this than maybe the other ones, but where are we at federally in addressing this?
Well, federally, it is both federal and provincial because of the mixed jurisdiction levels that we have within our country. So federally, certainly the NDP are pressing for solutions to poverty. The Liberals have so far talked a pretty good game about pharmacare, for example, and I think that the private members bill that's coming forward at the federal level is coming from a Liberal perspective. Provincially, it's the NDP who are pressing hardest, I think, but you may have an opportunity to talk to other parties as well within Alberta. So there are different, and of course there is cities. The City of Edmonton has been pressing hard for dealing with poverty and dealing with homelessness. So cities have a role to play as well. It's really all of society, though. I mean, poverty is a problem for the whole of society, and it's going to take the whole of society to solve it. So it's all of us. Carl, your hand's up again.
Are you recognizing me?
Yes, I am, Carl.
Okay. There's a question that I think human beings find hard to get away from, and it's accountability. If I see somebody misusing the resources that they've got, I'm inclined to be judgmental. Now I see a clerical collar on you there, and are you effective in quelling that sense among people that we want to see people be accountable for the money that they get, the resources that they get, for handling it properly and doing the right things? And when they do the wrong things, we can somehow manage to overlook that? Or how should we respond when we see misuse of all the different kinds of supports?
Well, I think that goes to the question of stigma in part, that I think we have this misconception that people want to misuse resources that are given. I mean, everybody makes poor choices in their life. All of us do. It's the nature of being sinful human beings. But I think it's much more popular to try to be, forcing accountability upon people who don't have many options in life. What about the accountability for, say, Jeff Bezos and his ridiculous sums of money, and his unwillingness to give paid sick time to his employees, and decent wages and decent working conditions? Why is he worth hundreds of billions of dollars US? We don't seem to talk about accountability for the staggeringly wealthy. Rutger Bregman at Davos a couple of years ago got himself into a little bit of trouble for pointing out that people were there talking about climate change and they'd all flown in on private jets. He made quite a stir, and it's a good point. So I think often when we talk about accountability, we talk about accountability for others rather than for ourselves, and frequently accountability for those who are the powerless. The story in the gospel today was, as Pastor James pointed out, a series of reversals. But we would think that Lazarus would be accountable for his condition, because often we think of we talk about the self-made man and the deserving rich and the deserving poor, and so initially you'd think of Lazarus as being deserving of his condition, and then surprised when he winds up in heaven. Accountability, but accountability needs to be applied to everybody in society. What's our carbon footprint? How are we using our wealth to improve the lives of society around us? That's the big issue. And I think that the push, particularly from wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations for tax cuts, is about avoiding accountability, responsibility to the whole of society. So maybe we could turn our eyes on accountability in that direction first.
Time for one last question from somebody. Who would like to have the honor or a comment? All right, well, I will maybe ask our guest presenter. Alan, do you have one last comment you would like to make?
I would just say that, I think we need to address poverty, and we need to address it now. And whatever combination of policies we choose to advocate for and push for, I think some kind of guaranteed minimum income is a helpful way forward. I think improving our basic services is a helpful way forward. And the time for debate and study is, I think, well past. We need to be working at implementation. The studies are there. the pilot projects have been conducted. It's really time for us to get on with it and get serious, because every day that we don't address poverty is a wasted day for people's lives. And on that note, I would just say thank you to so many of you who've come. I see a bunch of faces on my screen, and more than fit on my screen. So thank you so much for your commitment and your faithfulness and your interest in pushing forward this conversation. Glad to have been here. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
And time for us to thank our guests. Thanks very much for coming from all the way from Toronto, and swift trip back.
Thank you.